Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into Northern Corn Leaf Blight,
That's right.
NCLB, and we've got a really interesting company we're going to be looking at that's working on this and some fascinating sources
Yeah,
about the disease itself and how to deal with it. You ready to jump in?
absolutely. Let's do it.
All right. So you want to just give us like a quick rundown of like what is NCLB? What are we dealing with here?
Yeah. So, Northern Corn Leaf Blight, or NCLB, is a fungal disease,
Okay.
and it's caused by a pathogen called Exorahilum tursicum.
Okay, so it's fungus.
It is a fungus, and it's a pretty significant problem for corn growers.
I bet. When I was looking at this, I saw it can cause like up to a 50% yield loss.
That's right. Yeah. Up to 50% yield loss, and in severe cases, even more.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's a
Yeah.
big deal.
Okay. So if I'm a farmer
Yeah.
and I'm walking through my fields, how do I even know if I've got this? What am I looking for?
So the symptoms, they start out as kind of these long, grayish, green, or tan lesions on the leaves. And as the disease progresses, these lesions, they'll kind of expand and turn grayish brown.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually the whole leaf can just wither and die.
So it's pretty dramatic then once it really sets in.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You can see it from a distance.
Okay. So what's happening inside the plant when this is going on? Why is this so bad?
Yeah. So essentially what's happening is the fungus, it infects the leaves and it disrupts the process of photosynthesis.
Right.
So it's basically preventing the plant from producing energy,
Okay.
which weakens the plant, reduces grain fill, and that leads to those yield losses that we were talking about.
So it's like taking out its energy source, basically.
Exactly. It's like cutting off the fuel supply.
Wow. That makes sense. So now I'm kind of curious about this company that we're looking at. They're called Farmonaut, right?
That's right.
So what are they doing about all of this?
So Farmonaut is really interesting. They're using technology in a way that I think a lot of people wouldn't expect in agriculture. They're actually using satellites and AI to monitor crops.
So they're like looking at cornfields from space.
That's exactly what they're doing. They're using satellite imagery to monitor crops for signs of disease.
Wow.
And they're able to detect NCLB
Well,
really early on, even before you can see the symptoms with the naked eye.
really?
Yeah.
That's incredible. So how does that even work? How can they see that from space?
So they're using something called multispectral imagery. It's basically a type of imaging that captures light beyond the visible spectrum.
Okay.
So it can pick up on subtle changes in the plants that we can't see with our own eyes.
So they can see things that like indicate stress
Exactly.
before it's even visible to us.
Yeah. Like if the plant's starting to get stressed or if there's a disease starting to develop, they can pick up on those signals.
Wow, that's really cool. And then what do they do with that information?
So that's where the AI comes in.
Okay.
They have an AI system called Jeevan,
Okay.
and Jeevan analyzes all this data from the satellites, along with other information like weather data and historical disease patterns. And it gives farmers personalized recommendations on how to manage NCLB.
So it's like having a crop doctor in the cloud, basically.
Exactly. It's like having a 247 advisor.
That's wild. So they're really using technology to kind of get ahead of this problem before it even really becomes visible.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Wow. Okay, so we've kind of looked at this company that's using some really advanced technology,
Right.
but I also know there are a lot of traditional methods for dealing with NCLB.
Yeah.
What are some of those? What have farmers been doing for a long time to try to control this disease?
Yeah. So some of the traditional methods include things like crop rotation,
Right.
planting resistant varieties,
Okay.
residue management, and things like that.
So tell me a little bit more about those. Like, what is crop rotation and how does that help?
Sure. So crop rotation is basically the practice of alternating different crops
Okay.
in a field from year to year.
Okay.
So instead of planting corn in the same field every year, you might plant corn one year, soybeans the next year, and then maybe wheat the year after that.
Okay.
And what that does is it breaks up the disease cycle because NCLB is specific to corn.
So if you plant something else, the fungus doesn't have anything to eat.
Exactly.
So it dies out.
Right. It helps to reduce the amount of the fungus that's present in the field.
Okay, that makes sense. And then what about planting resistant varieties? What does that mean?
So there are certain varieties of corn that have been bred to be more resistant to NCLB.
Okay.
So they're less likely to get infected, or if they do get infected, they're able to withstand the disease better.
So it's like they have stronger immune systems.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the fungus has a harder time taking hold.
Yeah. So choosing the right variety can make a big difference.
Okay. And then what was the last one you mentioned? Residue management.
Yeah. Residue management,
What is that?
it basically refers to how you handle the crop residue after harvest.
Okay.
So the stalks and the leaves that are left behind.
Right.
And the reason that's important is because the fungus can actually overwinter
Okay.
in that residue and then reinfect the crop the following year.
Oh, so it's like a hiding place for the fungus.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So by managing that residue, you can help to reduce the amount of inoculum that's present in the field.
Gotcha. So I'm curious about the conditions that make this blight worse. Are there certain things that make it more likely to spread or cause more damage?
Oh, yeah, definitely. There are a lot of environmental factors that can influence
Oh, okay.
NCLB severity. So things like temperature and humidity play a big role. The fungus thrives in moderate temperatures
Okay.
and high humidity.
I was reading that like rainfall patterns can also have an effect.
Yeah, rainfall definitely plays a role because
Oh.
rain can help to spread the spores
Uh-huh.
and also create those humid conditions that the fungus love.
Gotcha. And I bet overhead irrigation could kind of have a similar effect, right?
Absolutely. Overhead irrigation can definitely contribute to the problem.
Okay. So managing moisture is important.
Yeah, moisture management is key.
Are there any other factors that kind of tip the scales in favor of this blight?
Yeah, so anything that stresses the plants can make them more susceptible
Okay.
to disease. So things like drought stress or nutrient deficiencies can weaken the plant's defenses and make them more vulnerable to infection.
So it's like when we're stressed,
Yeah,
we're more likely to get sick.
exactly. It's very similar for plants.
Gotcha. Okay, so now I'm kind of curious about the role of genetics in all of this. You mentioned resistant varieties earlier. Tell me a little bit more about how those are developed and what role plant breeders play in this whole fight against NCLB.
Yeah, so plant breeders play a crucial role
Okay.
in developing resistant varieties. They're constantly working to identify genes that confer resistance to NCLB,
Okay.
and then they incorporate those genes into new corn hybrids.
So it's like they're searching for those genetic superpowers.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, they're trying to find those genes that give the plants an edge.
That's so cool. And then how do they actually get those genes into the new corn hybrids? Is that a complicated process?
It can be a complex process, but essentially they use a variety of techniques,
Yeah.
including traditional breeding methods
Uh-huh.
and more modern techniques like genetic engineering.
So they have like a whole toolbox of techniques that they can use.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's amazing. I bet it's a lot like detective work trying to find those resistant genes and figure out how to use them.
It is. It's a lot of trial and error and a lot of patience.
But it sounds like it's really paying off. I mean, we have these resistant varieties now that are helping farmers fight back against this blight.
That's right.
That's really cool.
Yeah. It's a big success story in plant breeding.
So we've talked about crop rotation, resistant varieties, residue management. Are there any other traditional methods that farmers use to control NCLB?
There are a few other things that farmers can do,
Okay.
like practicing good field sanitation.
What does that mean?
So that basically means removing any infected plant material from the field. So if you see any plants that are showing symptoms of NCLB, you want to get rid of them as soon as possible to prevent the disease from spreading.
So it's like stopping it in its tracks.
Exactly. Yeah. And then another important thing is making sure the plants have adequate nutrition because healthy plants are better able to resist disease.
So it's like boosting their immune system.
Exactly.
I like that. Okay, so we've talked about all these different traditional methods. Now I'm kind of curious about the role of fungicides in all of this. Are fungicides commonly used to control NCLB?
Yes, fungicides are definitely an option for managing NCLB, and they can be very effective, but it's important to use them judiciously.
Why is that?
Well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, you want to make sure that you're only using fungicides when they're really needed.
Okay.
You don't want to overuse them because that can lead to the development of fungicide resistance.
So it's kind of like with antibiotics. If we overuse them,
exactly.
they become less effective.
Right. And then the other thing is you want to make sure that you're using the right fungicide for the job. There are a lot of different fungicides out there, and they have different modes of action. So it's important to choose one that's effective against NCLB.
Okay. So you really have to know what you're doing.
You do. It's important to work with a qualified crop consultant who can help you make the right decisions.
Okay. So if fungicides are used properly, they can be an important tool in the fight against NCLB.
That's right. They can definitely help to protect yields.
But it sounds like it's important to use them as part of an integrated pest management plan.
Absolutely.
Where you're using a combination of different strategies.
Right. It's all about finding the right balance.
Okay. So we've talked about traditional methods. We've talked about fungicides. So I'm kind of curious about the organic perspective on all of this. What do organic farmers do to manage NCLB?
Yeah, that's a great question. So organic farmers face some unique challenges
I bet.
when it comes to managing NCLB because they can't use synthetic fungicides.
Right.
So they really have to rely on those other methods that we talked about,
Okay.
like crop rotation, resistant varieties, and things like that.
And residue management.
Yeah, residue management is really important.
I imagine they have to be extra vigilant about scouting their fields and looking for those early signs of disease.
They do, yeah. And they also have to be really proactive about implementing those preventative measures.
So it's like they're playing a different game,
Yeah, in a way.
but they're still able to manage this disease effectively.
Right. They're just using a different set of tools.
Okay. I'm curious to know more about some of those tools. Are there any specific practices or products that organic farmers use that we haven't talked about yet?
Yeah, so there are a few things. One thing that organic farmers often use is compost teas.
Compost teas, what are those?
So compost tea is basically a liquid extract of compost.
Okay.
And it's rich in beneficial microorganisms,
Oh.
and those microorganisms can help to suppress disease.
So it's like giving the soil a probiotic.
That's a good way to think about it. Yeah, it's like boosting the soil's immune system.
Interesting. So it's not directly attacking the fungus,
Right.
but it's kind of creating a more healthy environment where the fungus is less likely to thrive.
Exactly.
Okay. Are there any other organic options for controlling NCLB?
Yeah, there are a few other things that organic farmers sometimes use,
Okay.
like certain biocontrol agents.
What are the...
So biocontrol agents are basically living organisms
Okay.
that can help to control pests or diseases.
So it's like fighting fire with fire.
Yeah, kind of. So,
Yeah.
for example, there are some fungi that are actually antagonistic to Xerohilum tursicum,
Wow.
so they can help to suppress the growth of the pathogen.
So it's like a fungus fighting a fungus.
Yeah, basically.
That's really cool.
It's pretty amazing.
So organic farmers really have a whole arsenal of tools that they can use.
They do. Yeah.
It's just a matter of knowing what they are and how to use them effectively.
Right. It takes a lot of knowledge and skill.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about the challenges of managing NCLB,
Uh-huh.
but I also want to talk about some of the successes. What are some of those promising developments in the fight against this disease? What gives you hope for the future?
Well, one thing that I'm really excited about is the development of new resistant varieties.
Okay.
Plant breeders are constantly working to improve the resistance of corn hybrids,
Good.
and they're making great progress, so that's really encouraging.
So we're going to see even better resistant varieties in the future?
I think so, yeah. And then another thing that I'm really excited about is the use of technology.
Okay.
Like we were talking about earlier, companies like Farmonaut
Right.
are using cutting-edge technology to help farmers manage NCLB,
Uh-huh.
and I think that has the potential to really revolutionize the way we approach disease management.
Yeah. I mean, being able to detect the disease early on and make those informed decisions,
Right.
that's huge.
It's a game changer.
Okay. So it sounds like there's a lot to be optimistic about.
There is, yeah. I think the future of NCLB management is looking bright.
That's great to hear. I'm curious, though, about the role of climate change in all of this. Do we know how climate change is impacting NCLB? Is it making the problem worse?
That's a good question, and it's something that scientists are still studying.
Okay.
But there's definitely some concern that climate change could exacerbate the problem.
Okay. How so?
Well, as temperatures rise
Mhm.
and weather patterns become more unpredictable,
Yeah.
it's possible that we could see more favorable conditions for NCLB development,
So we could see outbreaks in areas where it hasn't been a problem before.
potentially.
Yeah.
And we could also see more severe outbreaks in
Uh-huh.
areas where it's already a problem.
So it's like another challenge on top of all the other challenges.
Exactly.
Okay. So it's really important to keep an eye on this
Yeah, it's something that we need to be aware of.
and make sure that we're adapting our management strategies accordingly.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive into Northern Corn Leaf Blight.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation.
I've learned a lot. I'm curious to hear from our listeners. What are your thoughts on all of this? Have you encountered NCLB in your own fields? How are you managing it? Share your experiences and insights with us in the comments below.
We'd love to hear from you.
All right, so
Yeah.
we've talked a lot about traditional methods, fungicides, organic practices, the role of technology and plant breeding.
Right.
Now, I want to kind of step back and look at the bigger picture. What are the economic impacts of NCLB? How much is this disease actually costing farmers and consumers?
Yeah. So the economic impacts of NCLB can be substantial.
Okay.
As we talked about earlier, the disease can cause significant yield losses,
Right.
And that translates into lost revenue for farmers.
Makes sense.
And then, of course, those losses can also lead to higher prices for consumers.
Okay.
Because when supply goes down, prices tend to go up.
Right. It's like supply and demand.
Exactly.
So it's really a ripple effect that impacts the entire agricultural system.
It is.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so it's clear that NCLB is a serious problem with significant economic consequences. But what about the environmental impacts? Are there any concerns about the environmental effects of NCLB or the methods used to control it?
Yeah. So there are definitely some environmental concerns to consider. One concern is the use of fungicides.
Okay.
As we talked about earlier, fungicides can be effective in controlling NCLB,
Ah,
but they can also have negative impacts on the environment.
in what ways?
Well, some fungicides can be toxic to beneficial organisms,
Okay.
like pollinators or soil microbes,
Oh.
and they can also contaminate water sources.
So it's really important to use fungicides carefully
It is.
and only when they're absolutely necessary.
And to choose fungicides that have the least environmental impact.
Okay. Are there any other environmental concerns related to NCLB?
Yeah. Another concern is the potential for increased greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay. How does that work?
So when corn plants are infected with NCLB,
Uh-huh.
they're not able to photosynthesize as effectively,
Right.
which means they're not absorbing as much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere.
Okay.
And then when those infected plants decompose, they release that carbon back into the atmosphere.
So it's like a double whammy.
Yeah,
They're not taking in as much carbon dioxide.
like right,
And they're releasing more.
right. So that can contribute to climate change.
Okay. So managing NCLB effectively is not only important for economic reasons,
Right.
but also for environmental reasons.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today,
We have.
but I think it's clear that Northern Corn Leaf Blight is a complex issue with far-reaching consequences.
It
It's
is.
going to be really interesting to see how this all plays out in the years to come.
Yeah. I think we're going to see a lot of innovation in this area.
And I think technology is going to play a big role.
Definitely.
Okay. So I want to thank you for joining me today
It's been my pleasure.
for this deep dive into Northern Corn Leaf Blight.
I've really enjoyed it.
Me too. And I want to thank our listeners for tuning in. If you're interested in learning more about NCLB or about the company Farmonaut that we talked about earlier, we'll have links to some resources in the show notes. Until next time,
Happy farming.
stay curious
Yeah,
and keep on learning.
absolutely. It's like night and day. When you look at how quickly Farmonaut can assess a field compared to traditional scouting methods, you're talking about days versus hours. It's a huge time saver for farmers.
And I imagine that speed is really crucial when you're dealing with a fast-spreading disease like this.
Oh, absolutely. The sooner you can identify a problem, the sooner you can take action, and that can make all the difference in terms of minimizing yield loss.
Okay, so we're talking about speed, but what about accuracy? How does Farmonaut's technology compare to the good old-fashioned eyeball test?
Well, that's another area where Farmonaut really shines. Even the most experienced scout can miss those early signs of NCLB, especially in a large field. But the satellites and AI, they don't get tired. They don't miss a thing. They can analyze every single plant and provide a really precise assessment of disease severity.
So it's like having a microscopic eye scanning every inch of your fields.
That's a great way to put it. And that level of precision allows for really targeted interventions. You're not just treating the whole field with fungicides, you're focusing on the specific areas that need it.
Okay, so that brings us to cost effectiveness. How does Farmonaut stack up against traditional methods in terms of cost?
Yeah, so initially the upfront cost of using Farmonaut's technology might seem a little higher.
I bet.
But when you factor in the long-term savings, it actually becomes very cost-effective.
How so?
Well, think about it. If you can detect NCLB early on, you can often prevent it from spreading and causing widespread damage. That means fewer crop losses and higher yields, which translates to more revenue for the farmer.
Okay, so you're making more money because you're losing less of your crop.
Exactly. And you're also saving money on fungicides because you're only using them where they're really needed.
And of course, there's the environmental benefit of using fewer chemicals.
Absolutely. That's a big one.
Okay, I'm sold. Farmonaut sounds like a pretty amazing tool.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about the future. What are some of the emerging trends in NCLB management that you're excited about?
Well, one area that's really exciting is gene editing.
Okay, I've heard a lot about gene editing, but I have to admit, I don't really understand how it works. Can you break it down for me?
Sure. So gene editing is basically a way of making very precise changes to an organism's DNA.
Okay.
It's like having a pair of tiny molecular scissors that you can use to cut and paste genes.
So you can actually edit the genetic code of a plant.
Exactly. And that opens up all sorts of possibilities for improving crop traits.
So in the case of NCLB, you could potentially edit the corn's genes to make it more resistant to the fungus.
That's right. That's one of the main goals of gene editing for NCLB. And there's been a lot of progress in this area.
So we could potentially have corn that's naturally immune to this blight.
That's the hope. And I think it's a realistic goal.
Wow, that would be amazing. What other trends are you seeing in NCLB management?
Well, another trend that's really interesting is the development of new fungicides with different modes of action.
Okay.
So this is important because it helps to prevent the development of fungicide resistance.
Right, we were talking about that earlier. If we keep using the same fungicides over and over again, the fungus can become resistant.
Exactly. So having a diversity of fungicides with different modes of action is really important.
And it sounds like scientists are coming up with some new and innovative fungicides.
They are. Yeah, there's a lot of research and development going on in this area.
Okay, so we've got gene editing, we've got new fungicides.
Yeah.
Any other exciting developments on the horizon?
Yeah, another area that I'm really excited about is the use of precision agriculture techniques.
Okay, we talked a little bit about precision agriculture earlier with Farmonaut, but what other applications are there for this approach?
Well, precision agriculture is all about using technology and data to make more informed decisions about crop management.
Okay.
So in the context of NCLB, it could involve using sensors to monitor things like soil moisture and temperature, and then using that data to make decisions about irrigation and fungicide applications.
So you're really tailoring your management practices to the specific conditions in your field.
Exactly. You're not just treating the whole field the same way. You're taking into account the variability within the field.
Okay. I'm starting to see how all of these different technologies and approaches can work together to create a really comprehensive strategy for managing NCLB.
That's right. It's all about integrating different tools and techniques to create a system that's effective and sustainable.
Okay, so we've talked about the future of NCLB management, but I want to bring it back to the present. What can farmers do right now to protect their crops from this disease?
Well, the most important thing is to be proactive. Don't wait until you see symptoms of NCLB to start taking action.
Okay.
Implement those preventive measures that we talked about earlier, like crop rotation, planting resistant varieties, and residue management.
Okay, so those are your foundational practices.
Exactly. You want to have those in place from the start.
Okay.
And then you also want to be scouting your fields regularly, looking for any signs of disease.
Okay.
And if you do see any symptoms, you need to act quickly.
Right. Time is of the essence.
It is. And don't be afraid to reach out for help. There are a lot of resources available to farmers, including crop consultants and extension agents.
Like you said earlier, it's a team effort.
It is. We're all in this together.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about NCLB from the perspective of the farmer, but I also want to talk about the consumer perspective. How does this disease impact the food we eat?
Well, as we've discussed, NCLB can lead to reduced corn yields.
Right.
And that can have a ripple effect throughout the food system. So it can lead to higher prices for corn-based products like cornmeal tortillas and even meat and dairy products.
So it's not just about the price of corn itself.
Right. It affects the prices of a lot of different foods.
Okay.
Right.
So as consumers, we have a stake in this too.
We do. And I think it's important for consumers to be aware of the challenges that farmers face and to support sustainable agricultural practices.
That makes sense. So what can consumers do to support sustainable agriculture?
Well, one thing they can do is choose to buy food from local farmers who are using sustainable practices. They can also support policies that promote sustainable agriculture.
Okay.
And they can educate themselves about the issues.
Right. Knowledge is power.
It is.
Yeah.
The more we know about where our food comes from and how it's produced, the better choices we can make.
That's a great point. Okay, so we've talked about the farmer's perspective, consumer's perspective, the economic impacts, the environmental impacts. We've covered a lot of ground. But before we wrap things up, I want to ask you a more philosophical question. What do you think the future of agriculture looks like in a world that's facing increasing challenges like climate change and emerging diseases?
That's a big question.
It is.
Yeah.
But I think it's an important one.
I agree. I think the future of agriculture is going to be shaped by innovation and collaboration.
Okay.
We're going to need to find new and creative ways to produce food in a way that's sustainable and resilient,
Right.
and we're going to need to work together to do it. Farmer scientists, policymakers, consumers, we all have a role to play.
That's a great message. I think that's a perfect note to end on.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the interconnectedness of everything. One farmer's success or failure can have ripple effects that are felt across the entire food system and even globally.
Absolutely. It's like a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And it highlights the importance of finding those solutions that are not only effective, but also sustainable in the long run.
Exactly. We can't just focus on maximizing yield at any cost. We have to consider the environmental and social impacts as well.
Right. It's about finding that sweet spot where we can produce enough food to feed the world without compromising the health of our planet.
That's the challenge. And it's a challenge that I think we're up to. I mean, there's so much innovation happening in agriculture right now. It's really an exciting time to be in this field.
I agree. It's inspiring to see so many people working towards a common goal of a more sustainable and food-secure future.
Yeah, it gives me hope for the future.
Me too. Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, the solutions, the impacts, the future of agriculture. But I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Mm-hmm.
If you were a farmer facing the threat of NCLB, what would be your top priority?
That's a great question. I think my top priority would be to stay informed. I would want to be aware of the latest research, the best management practices, the new technologies that are available.
So it's all about knowledge.
Knowledge is power. And in agriculture, it can mean the difference between a successful harvest and a devastating loss.
That's a powerful message. And I think it applies to all of us, whether we're farmers or consumers. We all have a role to play in supporting a healthy and sustainable food system. And that starts with staying informed and engaged.
I couldn't agree more. Well said.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank you again for joining me for this deep dive into Northern Corn Leaf Blight.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And I want to thank our listeners for tuning in. We hope you found this episode informative and engaging. If you're interested in learning more about NCLB or about the company Farmonaut we talked about earlier, we'll have links to some resources in the show notes. Until next time, stay curious and keep on learning.